That morning, JFK International Airport seemed to wear a gentle cloak of rare tranquility. Not an empty, sterile silence, but a calm born of precision, where everything moved like the gears of a well-kept watch. Beneath the soft light filtering through the towering glass ceiling, the sound of rolling suitcases echoed rhythmically, neatly, as if every traveler were quietly marching toward a pivotal moment in their lives. At the first-class check-in area, two black teenagers stepped forward, a boy and a girl. They weren't loud, didn't burst into laughter, but something about them drew glances, a strange sense of composure for their age 15. Jaden Morgan, tall and slender with alert eyes and a calm face, pulled his charcoal gray suitcase with slow, steady movements. Beside him was Alina Morgan, his twin sister, whose deep brown eyes resembled a still lake. Her hair was neatly tied at the nape of her neck, and the cream-colored turtleneck sweater she wore gave her an air of quiet maturity. Far beyond her years, this trip wasn't just a vacation. It was a turning point, a kind of rite of passage meticulously planned weeks in advance by their father Anthony Morgan, the renowned CEO of OrionTech. No adults accompanied them, no housekeepers, no bodyguards, just two teenagers, two first-class ticket seats 1A, and one band, one final piece of advice from their father. Before they stepped out the door, you don't need to prove anything to anyone. Just remember who you are and act accordingly. Sometimes silence is the loudest voice. Jaden remembered that moment vividly. His father's smile, calm, proud, and filled with something deeper than words, had left an imprint. He didn't fully understand it then, but his heart held on to it. And today, as he stepped onto this flight, he felt the weight and meaning of it more than ever before. As they entered the priority boarding lane, a few security officers glanced their way. Nothing overtly rude, but Jaden noticed the flicker of hesitation in their eyes. He had grown used to those looks from a young age, but the feeling of being silently measured, judged by the color of his skin, never quite stopped stinging. Alina, as always, noticed what Jaden noticed, but she didn't say it aloud. Instead, she tilted her head and whispered, "Don't let it get to you. We don't need to react to everything." Jaden smiled faintly. "I'm not reacting. I'm observing." She nodded. That was what set them apart from many adults in the world. They didn't explode with anger, but they also didn't turn away. When they stepped into the first-class cabin of the Boeing 787 Dreamliner, a quiet reverence filled Jaden. The soft leather seats, the golden glow of the ambient lighting reflecting off the polished wood trays, and the subtle scent of high-end cologne lingering in the air, it all felt like they had entered another world. Jaden settled into seat 1A, gently reclining back, eyes half closed, letting himself fully absorb the silence that wrapped around him. Alina sat beside him, opening a small leather-bound journal, a gift from their father, her name faintly engraved on the cover. "Jaden," she said softly, her voice more like a thought spoken aloud than a question. "Do you think we're really ready for this journey?" Jaden turned to look at her, his gaze softening. "I think being ready doesn't mean not being nervous. It means knowing how to stay calm, even when we are." He smiled. "And if Dad believes we can do this, then I know we can." Alina smiled in return. She said nothing more, but her eyes shimmered with belief, not just in her brother, but in herself. A flight attendant appeared, young, elegant, and poised. With a professional tone and a practiced smile, she offered a slight bow. "Good afternoon, Mr. and Miss Morgan. May I offer you anything before takeoff?" Alina blinked in surprise at the formal titles she'd only ever heard used for her father. "Could we get some orange juice, please?" Jaden replied for both, his voice clear but gentle. The flight attendant nodded and walked away, leaving behind the teenagers slowly growing into the confidence the space required. Alina chuckled softly. "I think this trip will be something special." Jaden nodded. "I think so too. And I think some part of us will be different by the time we return." He said it without knowing just how true it would be. Outside the window, the sky had begun its shift from pale blue to shades of amber. As the sun dipped slowly toward the horizon, Clouds drifted by like soft invitations to another world, not one of privilege, but of courage, where identity is defined not by what you're given, but by how you rise. But then, like all stories that begin in quiet, disruption never comes with a loud knock. It enters softly, almost politely, and yet has the power to shake everything. Footsteps approach from behind, not hurried, but firm, and just like that, the first wave was about to crash. As the sunset spilled across the airplane wing, casting thin ribbons of gold and orange along the cabin walls, Jaden closed his eyes, soaking in a fleeting moment of peace. Beside him, Alina sat quietly, focused on reading a handwritten note from their father's journal. Her expression was as still and deep as a windless lake. Then came the sound, sharp, decisive, heels striking the floor with the precision of a metronome, echoing through the calm of first class like a warning bell. Alina was the first to lift her head. She didn't need to look long. The temperature in the cabin seemed to dip slightly, as if a sudden draft had slipped through a crack. Despite the sun still warming the skies outside, a woman stepped in, draped in a cream trench coat, carrying a Hermes handbag, her hair styled in deliberate waves, and her eyeliner drawn with blade-like precision. Rebecca Wallace, a name known to every seasoned crew member and frequent flyer of Skyline Airways. A Platinum Elite member for nearly 15 years, Rebecca didn't need to seek attention to command it. The way she walked as though the ground should part before her made her intentions clear. She wasn't the type to ask permission. She was even less the type to tolerate refusal. Her gaze swept across the cabin, quick, clinical, cold until it landed on seats 1A and 1B, where the black teenagers sat quietly in place. There was no greeting, no courtesy in her expression, only surprise, tightly bridled by rising irritation. Rebecca froze for half a second. Her brows furrowed instinctively. Her lips twitched slightly before pressing back into a rigid, imperious line. Jaden opened his eyes, sensing the stare. He sat up straight, meeting the woman's eyes defensively, but without lowering his gaze. "Can I help you with something, ma'am?" Jaden asked, his tone gentle yet alert. Rebecca didn't answer him directly. She turned to the nearest flight attendant and spoke in a tone sharp enough for the entire cabin to hear. "There must be a mistake. Seats 1A and 1B, those are mine. I always sit here. The airline must have logged something incorrectly." Alina turned her head slowly, voice calm but firm. "Our tickets clearly state these seat numbers, ma'am. Our father booked them 2 weeks ago." Rebecca rolled her eyes, as if she'd just heard something absurd from someone beneath notice. "Your father? Then it's clearly a system error," she said to the attendant, deliberately ignoring the two teens. "I'm a Platinum Elite member. I always sit here. No exceptions." The attendant, Lena, a young woman, stepped forward, hands slightly trembling. She knew who Rebecca Wallace was. Everyone in the airline did. And every time she flew, tension followed like turbulence. But this time, the seats had been properly reserved, and the passengers were in the right place. "Ms. Wallace," Lena began, trying to maintain composure, "the system clearly confirms seats 1A and 1B are assigned to Jaden and Alina Morgan. All details have been verified." Rebecca raised a brow. "Morgan? Never heard of them. Probably someone who bought last-minute tickets, with more ambition than sense." The contempt in her voice didn't need embellishment, dripped off each syllable. Alina felt a flush of heat rush to her cheeks, but gripped the armrest tightly. Jaden glanced at her, silently signaling restraint, not because they were afraid but because they didn't need to respond the way people like Rebecca expected them to. "We're sorry if sitting in our assigned seats is inconvenient to you," Jaden replied, his voice eerily calm. "But our tickets are correct. There's been no mistake." Rebecca let out a dismissive laugh. "So polite. I suppose your parents taught you to act civilized in spaces that aren't really meant for you." A few passengers turned their heads. A middle-aged man shook his head faintly. A woman adjusted her blanket as an excuse to look. But no one spoke up. Rebecca took a step closer. Her voice dropped but grew sharper. "You could sit just a few rows back. Still first class. I don't want to escalate this, but I won't sit anywhere else. These 2 seats are mine. Lena looked at Jaden and Alina as if silently asking whether they'd give way, even though she knew they were in the right. We're not trying to escalate anything. Alina spoke up for the first time. Her voice was steady, honed like a blade. We're simply holding on to our rights. The quiet conviction in her voice made Rebecca hesitate. A 15-year-old black girl, staring her down. Rebecca Wallace, the woman who had made more than a few flight crews, trembling calmly declaring her right to be there. Rebecca wasn't used to that, and in that split second, her restrained fury began to slip into something more raw, more aggressive. She turned to Lena and barked, "Get the head attendant." I don't argue with children. Alina looked at Jaden. In his eyes, she saw something familiar, calm in the face of the storm. A trait learned from a father who didn't need many words, but always knew exactly when to act. "Where do you think this is going?" she whispered. Jaden answered quietly, "I don't know, but I think this is the first test Dad warned us about." A heavy silence fell over the first-class cabin, not the kind that precedes a storm, but the kind that suffocates, when everyone hears but no one dares respond. Rebecca Wallace stood firm, arms crossed, her eyes cold and blade-sharp, fixed on the 2 teenagers seated upright in their seats, Jaden and Alina Morgan. It wasn't long before a woman older, in a neatly pressed uniform, stepped into the cabin from the rear. Her face carried the weight of experience, her eyes sharp yet professionally composed. This was Sandra Lewis, today's lead flight attendant, with over a decade of experience on international routes. Sandra stopped in front of Rebecca and offered a polite smile. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Wallace. I'm Sandra, the lead attendant. I understand there's an issue with your seat." Rebecca didn't let her finish. "There's no issue," she snapped. "There's a serious mistake. My seats, they have always been currently being occupied by 2 children." The word occupied was delivered with pointed emphasis, deliberately chosen. Sandra turned toward Jaden and Alina, passengers she had glanced at earlier, but hadn't paid much attention to. But now, as her eyes met their calm yet wary expressions, she paused. Not because they were young, but because of their presence, like those who've learned to face battles unspoken. "Far too early in life, Mrs. Wallace," Sandra began, her voice steady and courteous. "These seats were booked 2 weeks ago under the names Mr. Jaden and Miss Alina Morgan. All information has been verified through our system." Rebecca's brows pulled together. "Morgan? Never heard of them. Maybe they recently came into money, or they know someone. But that doesn't change the tradition of this flight. I've always sat here. I've been served here. I'm recognized here." Alina gripped the armrest slightly. For the first time in her short life, she witnessed an adult publicly question someone's worth, not because of behavior, but because they didn't fit the mold. And worse, she realized that those watching other passengers still said nothing. Jaden remained calm. "Ma'am, we're not here to cause trouble, but these are legitimate tickets, booked by our father. There's nothing wrong here." Rebecca smirked. "Don't call me ma'am. I don't need manners from people who don't even understand where they're sitting. This isn't a civics class. This is first class, on an international flight, and I won't be treated like second class just to make room for students." Her words weren't just sharp, they were heavy. Not just with condescension, but with something more entrenched, a quiet prejudice, not shouted, but woven into tone, into assumption, into the belief that she was the standard by which others were measured. Sandra began to falter. She glanced between the 2 teenagers and Rebecca, unease flickering across her face. She knew Wallace's reputation. Own misstep could spark an escalation that would affect the entire flight. "Perhaps," Sandra said gently, "we can consider a flexible solution. Seats 3A and 3B are also in the VIP section, still private." "Maybe the children," Alina cut in before Jaden could respond. "Flexible?" she asked, her voice low but razor clear. "Why is it always the person in the right who's asked to be flexible?" Jaden placed a calming hand on his sister's, signaling restraint. But in his eyes, too, A quiet fire began to burn out of rage, but disappointment. Disappointment in how power often chose comfort over principle. "We did nothing wrong," Jaden said slowly, deliberately. "We're not in the wrong seats. We're not breaking rules. And if we have to move just because someone thinks they're entitled, that's not flexibility. That's injustice." The air thickened, the weight of his words settling over the cabin like stone. Rebecca squinted, her lips pressed tightly. A man in the middle rows leaned forward as if to say something, then reclined back, weighing the risk of taking a side. Sandra hesitated. She stood between two worlds, a powerful long-time customer on one side, and two teenagers holding their ground with rare dignity on the other. Rebecca took a step closer, her voice dropping to a hiss. "Do you have any idea how much money I've given this airline over the past decade? And you think a single ticket is enough to change tradition?" Alina lifted her chin and looked straight into the eyes of a woman 3 times her age. "I don't need to change tradition," she said. "I just want to be treated like a human being." A long moment passed. Fina's soft sound broke the tension, the faint click of a phone call ending. Jaden had just set down his phone. He hadn't made an announcement. He hadn't threatened anyone. Just one quiet call. Rebecca turned toward him, suspicion darkening her gaze. "Who did you just call?" Jaden offered a faint, composed smile. "Someone I believe can remind everyone here of the difference between power and integrity." Alina looked at her brother, and without needing another word, she understood. The first wave had just been set in motion. Jaden's final words, "someone who can remind everyone here of the difference between power and integrity," dropped like a single drop of black ink into an already tense pool. No one knew exactly who he had called, but the atmosphere in the first-class cabin shifted immediately. Rebecca Wallace paused. Her eyes sharpened, yet a flicker of uncertainty appeared beneath the surface. She didn't truly believe a 15-year-old black boy could trigger any serious consequence, but the calm, unwavering tone in Jaden's voice introduced a sliver of doubt, and that doubt made her even angrier. Lead flight attendant Sandra Lewis glanced at Jaden, then turned to Rebecca. In her mind, calculations were forming. This wasn't just a seating dispute anymore. It was a confrontation between principle and privilege, between a longtime elite client and to teenagers who clearly weren't ordinary. "We can't delay departure any longer," Sandra said, trying to keep her tone neutral. "I'll do my best to find a solution that satisfies everyone. But I hope you understand not everyone," Alina interjected softly, but firmly. "Just one person." A few passengers turned to look. Again, the silence thickened, not peaceful, but exhausting. The kind of silence where right and wrong are clear, but no one wants to risk siding with justice. Jaden leaned slightly toward Sandra, for the first time actively addressing the most powerful crew member on board. "You can choose to stand with Mrs. Wallace," he said, "but that won't change the truth. If today the passengers being asked to leave their rightful seats were two white teenagers, would you still ask them to be flexible like you're asking us?" Sandra froze. The question wasn't accusatory, but it cut deep, like a scalpel. Inside her, an uncomfortable emptiness swelled, the feeling of someone who knew they were drifting from what was right, yet didn't have the strength to turn back. "Jaden," Sandra said carefully, "I don't mean to offend. I'm only trying to keep the flight on schedule, and to stay on schedule," Alina continued. "You're choosing silence in the face of discrimination. You're choosing to appease the louder voice." Sandra didn't reply. A faint flush crept across her face. In that moment, the truth was too sharp to deny. Rebecca folded her arms, smiling coolly. "You see, even the lead attendant knows that tradition should be respected." Jaden turned toward her. "Tradition isn't always right, ma'am. Some things people call tradition are really just injustice repeated so many times. It starts to feel acceptable." The air was vacuumed from the room. A man in seat to Celsius cleared his throat quietly, an awkward attempt to break the tension, but no one laughed. Sandra took a deep breath. She looked out the window, avoiding the twins' eyes. Chaos stirred inside her. She thought of her daughter Alina's age. with the same wide brown eyes, and wondered if it were her child being treated this way. Could she endure it? A voice buzzed through the earpiece at her temple. "Sandra, we've been given a 10-minute window to finalize the cabin. Any further delay will cost us takeoff priority." She touched the earpiece gently, then exhaled. A decision had to be made. "Jack," she called to a male flight attendant near the cabin door. "Check if seats 3A and 3B are still available. If so, escort the young passengers there. Full service applies." Alina turned to Jaden. Her face, until now composed, began to tremble, not from rage, but from a deep, rising heartbreak. "Did you hear that?" she whispered, voice shaking. "They're really pushing us out." Jaden gently squeezed her hand. He didn't look at her. His eyes were fixed on Sandra, the woman who had just chosen convenience over what was right. Jack nodded, then approached them. He kept his gaze low, avoiding eye contact with the children, whose eyes held more dignity than most adults' eye. "I'll check," he muttered, before walking away. No one spoke. Everyone, it seemed, was now confronting their own reflection, facing a part of themselves they preferred not to see. Rebecca looked at Jaden, smug. "You see, in the end, reality is still reality." Jaden turned back to her, not angry, not bitter, just unnervingly calm. "I'm not surprised," he said, "just sad, because some people, the older they get, the less dignity they carry." A man near the back, sitting by the exit row, shook his head. He began to stand, but his wife gently grabbed his sleeve and shook her head. He sat back down. Everyone saw, but no one spoke. Jaden and Alina stood in silence, no protest, no tears. They didn't leave because they were afraid. They left because they knew truth takes time to be hardened sometimes. Silence is the loudest way to speak. But before stepping away from the front row, Jaden turned, gave a small bow to Sandra, and said, "I won't say you're wrong. I just hope next time you choose right." And then the two of them walked away, leaving behind not just empty seats, but a vacuum where justice should have sat. The soft footsteps of Jaden and Alina padded across the carpeted cabin floor, to faint echoes reverberating through a space soaked in quiet injustice. No one had forcibly removed them. No orders had been barked, but every word from the lead attendant, every silent glance that sided with Rebecca Wallace, had nudged them out of seats that rightfully belonged to them. The plane hadn't even taken off, but justice had already left first class. Near the back of the cabin, behind the thick velvet curtain that separated VIP from economy, Jaden stopped. Alina was still trembling, not from fear, but from rage contained too long, a tightness in her chest that no scream could release. Jaden rested a hand on her shoulder. He didn't need to speak. They were twins. They understood each other without words. But this time, something in Jaden's eyes had shifted, not just endurance anymore, something deeper, a realization. They were no longer just the kind of children who endured quietly. They had crossed into awareness. "Wait here," Jaden said softly. He pulled his phone from his coat pocket and stepped into the narrow alcove. Near the carry-on compartment, a young flight attendant stood nearby, barely in her 20s, and the moment she met Jaden's eyes, she instinctively looked away. Jaden didn't accuse her. He didn't glare. He simply looked, and that was enough to make her feel seen. "Could you give me a moment?" he asked gently. She nodded quickly and walked away, saying nothing. Alina stood a few steps back, fingers gripping the leather-bound notebook from their father. She looked at her brother. Then she scanned the cabin around them, a place where no one had welcomed them. No one had defended them. No one had spoken a word. Jaden dialed, a sequence of digits he had memorized since childhood, only used when he needed something stronger than himself. One ring, 2, 3. Then a voice, deep, steady, familiar, like the warmth of a lamp in a quiet study. "Anthony Morgan." Jaden inhaled. "It's me, Dad." "Jaden." There was a brief silence. Then his father replied, calm as always, "Is something wrong?" Jaden glanced at Alina. She nodded slightly, as if handing him the last flicker of their shared courage. We were forced out of our seats 1A and 1B, Jaden said, his tone low but every word cut clean as glass. A passenger named Rebecca Wallace, some longtime VIP, claimed they were her seats. Said she always sits there, and the crew didn't stand with us. Anthony was silent for a few seconds. Jaden understood that silence. It meant his father was already calculating not revenge, but restoration, realignment. Did anyone touch you or Alina? Anthony asked, voice lowering. No violence, Jaden said, but they made us feel discarded, like our dignity weighed less than a platinum loyalty card. On the other end, Anthony Morgan rose from his chair at the top floor of OrionTech headquarters in Manhattan. A $1.5 billion strategy meeting sat paused on the conference table, but he needed no further justification. He turned to his assistant. Hold this, family. Urgent. Back on the line. Anthony Morgan, the man known across boardrooms as the architect of global tech, spoke with a calm that resonated like thunder just beneath the skin. You did the right thing. Jaden, no shouting, no fighting, but never back down. I'll handle the rest. You and Alina go back to your seats. Stand there. Don't yield what's already yours. Jaden felt warmth spread through him, not because his father was a billionaire, but because in that moment he knew he wasn't alone. He hung up and turned to Alina. We're going back, really, she whispered, her eyes still unsure. Jaden nodded. Dad's on his way, not on a plane, through truth, through presence. Together, they turned and walked back down the aisle. The passengers remained seated. No one stopped them, no one spoke. But the eyes were different now. Not contemptuous, not dismissive, something else. Curiosity, and perhaps guilt. Rebecca Wallace sat still in the front row, arms folded. As the twins returned, she raised a brow. Coming back to cause more trouble? She asked. Jaden didn't answer. Alina didn't either. They simply stood beside seats 1A and 1B. No protest, no request. Just standing. To living monuments to one principle. We are not wrong and we will not retreat. Rebecca opened her mouth to speak again, but then the cabin door opened again. A rare occurrence so close to takeoff. Two men stepped inside to suits dark as the midnight sky, bearing name badges that read Skyline Airways Executive. And in that precise moment everything began to shift. The sound of the cabin door unlocking echoed crisply through the aircraft, sharp and deliberate. No overhead announcement followed. No explanations were offered, but the entire first-class section fell into a hush so tense it felt like it could slice skin. Two men stepped in. They weren't dressed like flight crew, nor did they resemble ground staff. Their suits were tailored, their presence refined, and the gleaming Skyline Airways nameplates on their chests told the cabin one thing. They weren't here to ask, they were here to act. The first was in his early 50s, salt and pepper hair cropped short, a steely gaze beneath composed brows. His nameplate read, Robert Hill, Regional Director of Passenger Services, Northeast U.S. The second, younger, perhaps late 30s, with a surgical stride, and held a tablet in one hand. His nameplate, Daniel Price, Head of Internal Compliance. Rebecca Wallace, still seated neatly in seat 1, which did not belong to her, straightened her spine. But she wasn't afraid. She was confident. In her mind, if anyone would defend her prestige, it would be men like Robert and Danielle, people who understood the value of a long-time platinum elite flyer like herself. Sandra Lewis, the lead attendant, stepped back instinctively as Robert approached. Her face tensed, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. Robert spoke first, voice steady, composed, yet carrying undeniable authority. We are acting on direct instruction from President James Callahan's office. There has been a seating conflict involving passengers in 1A and 1B. We need to clarify the situation immediately. Rebecca rose with a slight smile. Perfect. Finally, someone with reason. She adjusted her coat, turning to Robert like a peer. It's likely just a small error. These seats 1A and 1B are mine. Everyone knows that. I've sat here for over 7 years. These children, perhaps they don't understand how things work yet. Robert did not respond to her. Instead, he turned toward Jaden, and Alanawo still stood quietly beside the seats. His gaze lingered on Jaden a few seconds longer. The boy was not pleading. He was simply standing there, emanating quiet dignity. And it struck Robert unexpectedly. Daniel Price stepped forward, unlocking the tablet in his hand. Permission to verify booking records. A few taps. On screen, the details appeared in bold clarity. Jaden Morgan Seat 1A, Alina Morgan Seat 1B, booking date. For weeks prior status. Confirmed VIP priority protocol, OrionTech corporate. Daniel turned the screen toward Sandra and Jack, the attendant standing nearby. We are dealing with passengers holding valid, confirmed tickets, booked under a strategic executive protocol. The silence in the cabin grew heavier. Robert's gaze sharpened as he turned to Sandra. I'll ask again. We were valid passengers removed from their seats, Sandra stammered. I was only trying to prevent a flight delay. Mrs. Wallace is a long-standing platinum member, so I thought asking the children to relocate might ease the situation. Daniel's voice cut in, cold and sharp. Ease the situation? Forcing two young passengers with verified seats to give them up to satisfy a privileged client. This is what Skyline Airways considers ease, Rebecca interjected, her tone stiffening. You're blowing this out of proportion. I simply requested the seats that have always been mine. It's not unreasonable. It's tradition. For the first time since entering, Robert turned directly to her. Mrs. Wallace, tradition should never be used to justify wrongdoing. Tradition does not override legal passenger rights, no matter who the person is. She opened her mouth, but Robert had already turned away. He faced Jaden and Alina. With a respectful nod, he said, I apologize. This should never have happened. Neither Jaden nor Alina responded, but something in their expressions shifted. Doubt, the sting, the quiet hurt began to melt into something else, restored faith. Daniel pulled out his phone and swiftly typed a short message. Then he turned to Sandra. This flight has now been escalated to executive review. You and flight attendant Jack Harris are hereby suspended pending internal investigation. After landing, you were given a choice and you chose wrong. Sandra's face went pale. Jack, standing behind her, dropped his eyes to the floor, fists clenched tight. Rebecca, realizing the balance of power had tilted beyond her control, stepped forward, voice rising. I will file a complaint with the board. You can't treat me like this. Daniel didn't blink. You are free to file any complaint you wish, but Platinum Elite does not grant the right to violate someone else's dignity. Effective immediately, your elite privileges are suspended pending further review. The blow landed directly to the center of Rebecca Wallace's well-guarded pride. For the first time, she said nothing. Robert turned back to the cabin door. The matter is resolved. Everyone return to your seats. This flight will depart in 15 minutes. Jaden and Alina took their seats once more. No one protested. No one murmured. No one looked at them with doubt anymore. They didn't smile. They didn't gloat, but in their eyes, something was clear. Dignity had returned to where it belonged. As Robert Hill finished speaking and turned toward the cabin door, the atmosphere seemed to shed a layer of suffocating weight. But not everyone exhaled, because some silences aren't peace, thy fear. Jaden and Alina took their seats 1A and won their rightful places reserved weeks ago by their father. No one said a word to them. No one offered an apology. But this time, the eyes that turned toward them had changed. No longer dismissive, not pitying. Something closer to respect. Rebecca Wallace remained standing, frozen in place. The poise she had worn like armor was gone. Her lips, dry and tight, pressed into a stiff, withering line. For the first time in all her years flying, she faced a bitter truth. Power no longer guaranteed immunity. Daniel Price stepped forward, addressing Sandra and Jack, to attendants standing like statues. His voice wasn't raised, but each word struck like a gavel on marble. Lead attendant Sandra Lewis, Flight Attendant Jack Harris. As of this moment, you are both officially suspended pending internal investigation for professional misconduct, favoritism, and failure to protect the lawful rights of passengers. Sandra's hands trembled. She tried to stay composed. I didn't realize it had escalated to this. I was only trying to keep the cabin in order. I didn't intend to discriminate. Daniel cut in. Voice like ice. Silence in the face of injustice is not neutrality. It is complicity. The words landed like a hammer blow. Sandra didn't flinch in fear of losing her job. She flinched because she felt shame. A deep, unfamiliar shame she didn't yet know how to name. Jack lowered his head, voice hoarse. I was only following her lead. Daniel responded sharply. You were the attendant in this cabin. You stood by while passengers were humiliated and displaced, and you said nothing. Don't shift blame. Silence is not neutrality. It is taking a side. The message wasn't just for them. It was for every passenger seated in first class, and they heard it clearly. Some leaned forward. Others adjusted their coats. A few averted their eyes. But in their hearts, one question echoed louder than guilt. What did I do? Or more truthfully, what did I not do? Robert turned to Rebecca. She still hadn't moved. The shadow of the powerful woman she had been now cracked like worn porcelain. Mrs. Wallace, he said, calm but final. President Callahan has already issued a directive to review your membership status. After assessing the events of today, your Platinum Elite status is hereby permanently revoked. Rebecca recoiled, as if struck. You can't do this. I've been a loyal customer. I've spent hundreds of thousands every year. I know people on the executive board. I will sue. You're free to take whatever legal action you choose, Robert replied, unbothered. But we will not allow anyone, regardless of their status, to weaponize privilege, to strip others of their basic human dignity. Skyline Airways does not serve entitlement when it tramples equity. For a long moment, no one said a word. Rebecca turned and scanned the cabin. Every face watched her now, but none with deference, none with warmth. Only the quiet judgment of those who once stood behind her and now saw her for who she truly was. She let her hands fall to her sides. No more threats, no apologies, just a woman who had lost everything. Standing with empty hands and nowhere left to place the blame, the cabin door opened again. Two uniformed airport security officers stepped in citigrade jackets, calm but resolute eyes. They said nothing. They didn't need to. Robert nodded. Mrs. Wallace will be escorted off the aircraft. This is not punishment. It's the restoration of order only that she disrupted. A flicker of pride warred with resistance in Rebecca's expression. But eventually, she rose. Each step in her high heels echoed heavier than the last. No one bid her farewell. No one offered sympathy. She walked the aisle alone. The cabin door closed behind her. A door. A chapter. An era of entitlements. Jaden and Alina sat quietly. They didn't look back. They didn't smile. They didn't clap, only silence. But this time, not the silence of suppression. The silence of victory won, without ever needing to raise their voices. Daniel turned to Robert and gave a quiet nod. The passengers are ready. Robert looked down at the two teenagers. Thank you both for today. You didn't just defend your own rights, you helped all of us remember something we'd forgotten. Jaden dipped his head slightly. Alina replied softly, we didn't do anything grand. We just didn't accept being pushed away when we were right. And so they sat, as if they had never left. But this time, they sat with dignity. The cabin door had closed behind Rebecca Wallace less than a minute ago, yet to her, it echoed like the final bolt sealing off an entire personal era. It wasn't about being removed from the plane. It wasn't about Seat 1A. It was about what she had truly lost: invisible armor she had worn for years, social power, unnamed privilege, and the belief that being well-connected meant never having to face consequences. She walked the jet bridge in silence. The two security officers flanked her without a word. No handcuffs, no force, but the silence weighed heavier than any accusation. She didn't walk like a passenger being escorted. She walked like a fallen symbol. But it wasn't over, not in her mind. Her thoughts were still flooded with the sharp-edged words. Platinum status revoked. Permanent suspension. Bias. Violation of human dignity. Each phrase lodged itself in her mind like barbed wire. And the more she tried to rip them out, the more they cut. Rebecca stopped in front of the lounge entrance. Her hand trembled in fury as she clutched the handle of her designer bag. For a moment, she reached for her phone to call her lawyer. But then, she turned around. A ground agent approached quickly. "Ma'am, that flight is preparing for departure. I need to get back on that plane," Rebecca snapped. "I have a right to speak directly with the captain." "I'm sorry, ma'am," the agent stammered. "That's not possible. The manifest is closing. The aircraft, no one gets to push me out like this," Rebecca shouted. Her voice pierced the terminal like shattered glass. Gate 18 went silent. "I've held that seat 1 of 4 nearly a decade. A couple of spoiled kids and some self-righteous directors don't get to erase that." Her words rang metallic, hollow. The two security officers exchanged glances. One raised a radio. The other stepped forward. "Mum, if you do not cooperate, we will have to proceed with formal enforcement under airport code." Rebecca didn't hear him. She yanked her arm free and lunged toward the boarding gate. Everyone froze, and then it happened. She ran, screaming, "I demand to speak to the captain. I will not have my name dragged through the mud because of 2 entitled brats and some faceless CEO." Nearby, a passenger lifted their phone and began filming. The disbelief on their face said it all. This was the woman who once graced Skyline Airways ads, now unraveling in public like a figure no longer in control. Within seconds, 4 additional airport security personnel arrived, along with 2 aviation police officers. No shouting, no violence. But this time there would be no second chances. "Mrs. Wallace, you are now in violation of Class 1 security zone regulations. Your actions may be subject to both civil aviation and criminal penalties." Rebecca struggled as they held her arms. She continued yelling, "I'm a VIP. I am the financial backbone of this airline. What do those kids even have? Who gave them the right to take my seat?" No one answered her. From across the terminal, the departure screen updated silently. "Skyline 473 San Francisco cabin ready, preparing for departure." Rebecca Wallace was escorted out of the security zone. Flashbulbs from phones and reporters caught the scene as it began to spread like wildfire. Across social media, within 15 minutes, the footage of her final breakdown had gone viral. Back on board, Jaden sat upright, his gaze fixed on the window. He couldn't see what was happening outside, but inside, something had shifted permanently. No longer the feeling of being wronged, but the clear understanding that silence itself can be a voice if you choose the right moment to let it speak. Alina sat beside him, still holding tightly to the leather journal their father had given them. She hadn't spoken in several minutes, but in her eyes was a light that no longer wavered. It was deep, quiet, and unbreakably proud. A new flight attendant, Jung Campos, had approached. He placed 2 glasses of fresh orange juice gently on their trays. "On behalf of Skyline Airways," he said softly, bowing his head with sincere respect, "we would like to serve you as you should have been served from the very beginning." Jaden nodded. "Thank you." No other words were exchanged, but it was enough. That silence now spoke louder than any applause. It was the sound of an era ending, an age of unchecked privilege finally coming undone. Rebecca Wallace may have occupied seat 1A for nearly a decade, but today it was the 2 young passengers once cast aside who reminded a nation. Power does not reside in loyalty cards. It lives in the courage to speak for what's right when no one else will. The Boeing 787 flight Skyline 473 began its slow roll down the runway. After a series of seismic moments, first class was now unnervingly quiet. No murmurs, no sidelong glances. Instead, there was a different kind of silence, the kind that settles when people witness an earthquake. Not of the earth, but of consciousness. Jaden closed his eyes and exhaled slowly. He wasn't sleeping. He wasn't relaxing. The echoes of Rebecca Wallace's voice's last cries of a dying entitlement still lingered in his mind, but now they held no power. Alina leaned gently against her brother's shoulder. Neither said a word, but her hand, resting on their father's leather-bound notebook, still radiated warmth. It was filled with notes, reminders, and quiet convictions from Anthony Morgan, a man not present on the aircraft, yet the most powerful force aboard. At Skyline Airways headquarters in New York, an emergency meeting was convened just 3 hours after the video of Rebecca Wallace went viral. No flashbulbs, no press, but the tension in the room was sharper than any courtroom. At the center sat James Callahan, veteran airline executive and president of Skyline Airways. Around him, senior directors of customer relations, route operations, flight crew training, legal, and HR. On the screen behind them, a 3-minute video looped in silence. Rebecca Wallace screaming, thrashing, being escorted away. But it wasn't the image that shook the room, it was the audio. Her voice, "I'm a VIP. I won't give up my seat to the black kids. Who do they think they are?" No one spoke when the video ended. Callahan removed his glasses and placed them on the table. He looked around slowly. "We can discuss protocol. We can dissect individual decisions. But before we do," he said, calm and firm, "you all need to recognize that this is no longer an internal incident. This is a cultural reckoning." The head of legal nodded. "We've received over 12,000 emails in 6 hours. More than 3,000 came from partners, shareholders, and civil rights organizations." "How many requests to cancel membership?" Callahan asked. "Close to 800. Of those, 120 were Platinum Elite members, 60 were corporate clients." There was no need for more numbers. Callahan inhaled deeply. The greatest failure wasn't just the crew, and it wasn't entirely on Mrs. Wallace either. It was the system. We built a hierarchy of privilege with no guardrails for human dignity. Every eye remained fixed on him. Jaden Morgan and his sister Alina weren't demanding upgrades. They weren't looking for headlines. They simply wanted to sit where they were supposed to sit. They said nothing. But it's because they said nothing that the world is now listening. One executive offered, "We need to issue a public apology." Callahan nodded. "And more than that, we need reform." He turned to the internal communications director. "I want a system-wide campaign. Call it respect above rank. The message must be clear. Skyline Airways places passenger dignity above any membership tier." He paused, his voice lowered. "Also make Jaden and Alina's story a mandatory case study. Every flight attendant, ground agent, and supervisor will study this incident. Training begins next month." HR began drafting notes. No applause, no slogans. Just a turning point, a reckoning Skyline never thought it would face. A slap delivered not by power, but by two teenagers armed only with quiet resilience. Back on board the aircraft roughly 40 minutes after takeoff, a different attendant approached Jaden and Alina. Her uniform was understated. No visible rank, but her posture was calm, steady. "Good evening," she said softly. "My name is Irene Beck. I serve as Skyline's internal ethics liaison. I've been asked by President Callahan to deliver a formal apology to both of you and to the Morgan family." Alina's brows lifted slightly. Jaden nodded politely. "Thank you." Irene continued. "There will be a press conference in the next 24 hours. But President Callahan wanted you to hear this first. What happened today will not be forgotten. It will become the foundation of a new codion built on fairness and dignity." Jaden glanced at his sister, then looked back. "We didn't do anything extraordinary. We just refused to bow our heads." Irene smiled gently, nodded, and stepped away. At San Francisco International Airport, as the plane touched down, there were no trumpets, no announcements. But outside Gate 15, a small circle of journalists had already gathered. They weren't hunting for scandal. They were seeking a story. When Jaden and Alina stepped out, no one swarmed them, no microphones shoved in their faces. But a female reporter from the Atlantic approached quietly. "If you could say one thing to those who've remained silent in the face of injustice," she asked, "what would you say?" Jaden paused for a beat, then replied, "Don't think you're too small to make change. Sometimes, just staying in your seat is enough to make the whole system listen." Alina took his hand and added, "Justice isn't about where you sit. It's about whether you'll lift your head when the world tells you to look down." 3 days after the incident, aboard Skyline Flight 473, a quiet ceremony took place at the airline's headquarters in New York. It wasn't a celebration. There were no ribbon cuttings, no roaring applause, no LED displays. But in the stillness of that solemn space, a door quietly opened for the future of air travel. On a modest stage inside the 47th floor executive hall usually reserved for high-level board meetings, 2 cream-colored seats had been placed, facing rows of company executives, communications directors, and over 100 Skyline employees. They weren't ordinary seats. They were exact replicas of 1A and 1B from the original flight. Embroidered in silver thread on their headrests were 2 lines of quiet power. For those who stayed seated when told to leave, for the young who held their place with dignity. When Jaden and Alina Morgan were invited to the stage, the room fell utterly silent. There were no cheers, no slogans, only the heavy presence of 2 15-year-olds who had forced an entire system to look inward. President James Callahan stepped to the microphone. His face was not that of a CEO unveiling a new initiative, but of a man finally reckoning with the structure he helped build. "Jaden, Alina," he began, voice steady and low, "we did not invite you here to apologize because that has already been done. And it was the bare minimum. Today, we want to thank you, not for your courage, but for not giving up in a moment when so many adults chose silence." Jaden and Alina held their composure modest, unflinching. At their age, they should have been worried about homework and after-school clubs, but instead, they had stood quietly against a giant and didn't move. Callahan continued, "Seats 1A and 1B, we thought they were just positions on a manifest, but they became something else. They became symbols of what we've lost: fairness, kindness, and the ability to see human beings as human beings, not as tiers, titles, or skin tones." He gestured toward the chairs. "From this day forward, every Skyline training center will feature these 2 seats, and every person, whether a new recruit or senior supervisor, will sit in them at least once, not to be served, but to understand what it feels like to be asked to leave, simply because someone else believed they belonged more." Another silence filled the hall, but this time, it wasn't one of guilt. It was awareness. Later that afternoon, in a quiet Brooklyn park, Jaden and Alina sat side by side on a familiar bench under maple trees, slowly turning gold. In the distance, people walked dogs, played basketball, laughed freely as if the world hadn't shifted just days before. Their father, Anthony Morgan, arrived moments later with 3 steaming cups of ginger tea. He handed one to each of them before sitting between his children. "Did you read the New York Times piece yet?" he asked, his tone thoughtful. Jaden nodded. "Yeah." The title was strange when his seats told the moral story of America. Anthony chuckled softly. "I liked another line even better," he said. "For years, we handed privilege a first-class ticket. Then, for the first time, to 15-year-olds made it sit back and wait." Alina smiled, stirring her tea. "We never meant to become a symbol. We just couldn't stay quiet when something felt wrong." Anthony looked at his daughter, eyes filled with silent pride. "And sometimes, the ones who don't want to become symbols end up being the ones we should follow." He paused, turning to Jaden. "I know when you called, you weren't asking for someone to come and fix things. You just needed someone to believe you belonged there, and I always will." Jaden didn't reply, but he nodded. His eyes glinted with a quiet light, like a small lamp glowing against the dusk. 1 week later, Skyline Airways publicly announced its new passenger conduct initiative. Titled One Sky, Equal Seat, the policy didn't just promise fairer service. It established mandatory unconscious bias training for all employees, protocols for handling conflict rooted in prejudice, a new passenger ethics council made up of community leaders, frequent travelers, and sociologists. In their press release, Skyline declared, "We cannot undo the past, but we can learn from it so that the skies above us become a place not of division, but of dignity." And somewhere, in a Brooklyn high school classroom, a social studies teacher introduced a new topic. When is silence the wrong choice? On the screen, a still image of two negotiated side by side in 1A, and one base is calm, eyes forward, unafraid. Because a seat is never just a seat. It's a quiet declaration that says, "I matter," and if you can hold that truth not with noise, but with stillness, the world will pause and listen. Jaden and Alina didn't change the world in a day, but they made it start to change from deceit and from unwavering grace.